Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we will start talking about the bones, so let's start. Bones, as we know, are a rigid tissue that forms the skeleton of our body, and the purpose of this skeleton is to provide organs protection also and to produce RBCs and white BCs. It also stores minerals of the body and provides the liver for the muscles to act upon the body. So it supports the body and enables the mobility of the body. Now, there are various shapes and sizes of bones, and they form the structure of the body, and they are lightweight yet very strong and hard, and have different functions as we mentioned earlier. The bony tissue, or the osteoid or osseous tissue, is a hard tissue. It's a special form of connective tissue. It has the honeycomb appearance, as you can see here. This is the unit of the that forms the bone, and it's responsible for the bone's rigidity. The bony tissue composed of many types of cells, like the osteoblasts, the osteocytes, and the osteoclasts. The osteoblasts and osteocytes are responsible for formation and mineralization of bone, while the osteoclasts, which come from different lineage or different precursor cells, they are responsible for bone resorption, or you can call it the bone eating cells. And now the osteoblasts become the lining that form a protective layer on the bone surface. These are special types of osteoblasts present on the bone surface. Now all this lies in a matrix of bone tissue. The matrix is composed of organic component and inorganic component. The organic component is called the ossein, and the inorganic component is composed of minerals deposited in this matrix. There are two types of mineralized tissue of bone. There's the cortical bone, which is present on the surface of the bone and gives it its rigidity, and the inside of the bone is called the cancellous bone, which is thrown into what's so-called trabeculae, as you can see here. The inside of the bone is different than the outside of the bone. There are other tissues found in bone, including the bone marrow, the endosteum, the periosteum. The endosteum is the inner lining of the compact bone. The periosteum is the outer lining of the bone itself. There are nerves and blood vessels and cartilage involved in formation of the bone tissue. In the human body, early in development, there are around 300 bones present, but many of them fuse together. So we end up with a total of 206 separate bones in the adult. The largest bone in the body is the femur, which is the thigh bone, as you can see here, and the smallest is the stapes inside the middle ear, part of the ear ossicles, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The stapes is the smallest bone in the body. Now, for the structure of bone, it has a solid part and a flexible part. The flexible part comprises 30% of its structure, and the minerals responsible for its rigidity is about 70%. They are thrown into what's so-called the woven arrangement, and they are remodeled throughout life by a group of specialized bone cells. The matrix, which comprises 90 to 95% of bone, the bone matrix is 90 to 95% composed of elastic collagen fibers known as the ossein, and the remainder is ground substance. The matrix is hardened by deposition of salts or mineral salts called calcium phosphate in a special arrangement of a chemical compound called the calcium hydroxyl apatite. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the bone minerals are responsible for the bones, giving the bones its rigidity. The bone is continuously remodeled throughout life by means of action of osteoclast that eats up bone, and osteoblasts and osteocytes which deposit bone. Within any single bone, the tissue is thrown into woven structure. Woven means interlaced or haphazard structure, and it eventually takes the forms of two foams, the cortical and the cancellous bone. The cortical is on the outside, and the cancellous bone or spongy bone is on the inside of each bone. Now, this is a drawing of the unit of the bone, which is called the osteon. This arrangement, concentric layers of osteoblasts trapped in lichene to become osteocytes around a central canal called the Haversian canal. This is called the osteon. This is the principal unit of bone formation. Notice that these osteocytes connect to each other with processes running through small or tiny canals called canaliculi. So each osteocyte surrounded by many canaliculi containing the processes of this osteocytes to communicate with the neighboring osteocytes through gap junctions, as we will study later. This is the Haversian system of bone. Now, the cortical bone, or the outer layer of bone, is called the compact bone. It's much denser than the inside bone, which is cancellous bone. The cortical bone is responsible for the smooth and white and solid appearance of bone. It accounts for 80% of the total bone mass in the skeleton. It provides the main function of bone, which is support for the structure of the body and a lever action or lever for movement of the muscles attached to the bone. Also, it protects the underlying organs and stores and release chemical elements, mainly calcium. So it plays an important role in calcium homeostasis under the control of hormones such as the parathyroid hormone secreted from the parathyroid glands and calcitonin. The bone consists of multiple microscopic columns, as we mentioned before. It's called the Haversian system. Each column is multiple or concentric layers of osteoblasts and osteocytes. Actually, the osteocytes are trapped osteoblasts in their lichene. Note here that there are transverse canals connecting the Haversian systems together. They are called the Volkmann's canals. At right angles connect the osteons together. And the cortical bone is covered by periosteum and endosteum on its inner surface. The endosteum is the boundary between the compact bone and the cancellous bone. The primary anatomical function unit of the cortical bone is called the osteon, as you can see here. Cancellous bone, it has other names: trabecular bone or spongy bone. It's in the form of network of bone thrown inside the main bone itself. It has a higher surface area because it's thrown into trabecularly. Higher surface area to volume ratio. This provides a great surface area for metabolic activities such as exchange of calcium ions, but on the expense of its on the expense of its strength. It's weaker and more flexible than the compact bone. Now you can find it inside the bone, especially at the ends of long bones. And if you cut, for example, or take a section in the head and neck of the femur, you will find the cancellous bone thrown into a special arrangement to transmit the forces applied to the bone. The cancellous bone is highly vascular and contains red bone marrow, where the red bone marrow is the site of hematopoiesis, means production of the elements of the blood, like white blood cells and red blood cells and platelets. Now, formations of osteoblasts covered in the endosteum inside the bone, thrown into formation known as trabeculae. Within the spaces of the trabeculae are the bone marrow and the hematopoietic cells that give rise to the platelets, like the megakaryocytes, for example. Megakaryocytes responsible for formation of platelets, red blood cells precursors, and white blood cells precursors. The bone marrow, also called as the myeloid tissue in red bone marrow, it's found anywhere where there is cancellous bone, because the cancellous bone holds the bone marrow together. In the newlyborns, the bones are filled exclusively with red bone marrow or hematopoietic marrow, but with the age, as the person advances in age, the fraction of hematopoietic tissue decreases in quantity, and the fatty yellow fraction, called the marrow adipose tissue, increases, but not replaces totally the hematopoietic fraction. In the adults, on the other hand, the red bone marrow is mostly found in the bone marrow of the femur, the ribs, vertebrae, and pelvic bones. And notice that these are the sites for the doctors to take samples of bone marrow to examine. For example, in cases of leukemias, either samples from the femur, the ribs, the vertebrae, and the pelvic bones, especially the iliac bones. Now, for the bone cells, they include the osteoblasts, osteocytes, and the osteoclasts. The osteoblasts and osteocytes, they are responsible for bone deposition and mineralization and matrix formation. The osteoclasts are responsible for bone resorption or bone eating, as we discussed earlier. The osteoblasts become osteocytes, so actually they are both derived from the same precursor cells called the osteoprogenitor cells, but the osteoclasts from different lineage. They come down from the cells that give rise to macrophages and monocytes, so that's why they have the phagocytic function or bone resorption function. Within the marrow of the bone, there are also hematopoietic stem cells The cells give rise to other cells, including white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. Now, to discuss the cells individually, the osteoblasts are mononucleate. You can see here, these are osteoblasts, but the ones with spaces around are osteoblasts that became osteocytes, as you can see here. They are located, the osteoblasts, in a protein mixture known as the osteoid, which mineralizes to become bone. The osteoid is primarily composed of type 1 collagen. Osteoblasts also manufacture hormones like the prostaglandins, for example, to act on the bone itself. Since they form bones, so they are responsible for the repair of new bone by actually building around self. First, the osteoblast puts up collagen fibers around it, and these collagen fibers and then deposit minerals like calcium phosphate, which is hardened by hydroxide and bicarbonate ions. The new formed bone created by osteoblasts is now called the osteoid. And this is what happens in healing of fractures. Once the osteoblast is finished working, it becomes trapped because of the collagen deposited around it and the matrix. When the osteoblast becomes trapped, it's known as osteocyte. The osteocyte has several processes that run in canaliculi to communicate with nearby osteocytes. There are other osteoblasts that remain on the top of the new bone and are used to protect the underlying bone. These become known as the lining cells. The osteoblasts are rather a little bit flatter than the osteocytes after the osteoblasts being trapped in their lacunae. Osteocytes, they are of mesenchymal origin, as you can see here, and originate from osteoblasts that have migrated and become trapped and surrounded by bone matrix. The spaces the cell body of osteocytes occupy within the mineralized collagen type 1 matrix is known as lacunae. These are the lacunae, evident lacunae, as you can see here. While the osteocyte cell processes occupy channels called canaliculi, we saw that in different picture. The canaliculi connect with each other to allowing the processes of the osteocytes to make contact through gap junctions between the processes of osteocytes. And these junctions or gap junctions formed by the processes of osteocytes are for communication purposes. Now, don't confuse this with the Volkmann's canals that connect osteons together, the connect systems together. They are at right angles with the Haversian system. The canaliculi are different than the Volkmann's canals. The osteoclast, which is the last cell type, is a multi-nucleate cells. As you can see here, this is an osteoclast with multiple nuclei, and they are responsible for the breakdown of bones by the process of bone resorption. This occurs because bone remodeling continues throughout life. Remodeling means resorption of bone, then being replaced by deposition of bone by the osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Now, the place where the osteoclasts exist in is called the resorption pits or the Hauschipp's lacunae. These lacunae are formed by the resorption action of the inside osteoclast. Because the osteoclast is derived from monocyte stem cell lineage, they have a phagocytic function, so they are equipped with phagocytic-like mechanisms similar to the circulating macrophages. It's for the purpose of bone resorption. And they mature and migrate to the discrete bone surfaces. The reabsorption of bone by osteoclasts also plays a role in calcium homeostasis, and actually controlled by hormones that control calcium homeostasis, like parathyroid hormones and the calcitonin. In hyperparathyroidism, for example, there is increase in the activity of osteoclasts, so increase in the activity of bone resorption and high calcium levels in the blood, leading to weakness of the bone, or depletion of calcium from the bone. I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.